Hello, everybody. Wow, already 51 people. Hello, everyone. Numbers continue going up, so we'll wait a minute or two before we actually get started. All right. It looks like we've reached a pretty stable number, so let's get started. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center, or CCASC, seminar series. Our goal at these virtual gatherings is to highlight research that supports climate adaptation across the Southeast. So my name is Maggio Laquidara, exotic name, and I am a graduate student at North Carolina State University and a CCASC Global Change Research Fellow and your host this afternoon. I will open with a few Zoom logistics and request your feedback through a short poll, and then we can actually get started with our speakers today. So the first piece of Zoom instructions I would like to share has to do with some old and new features. So we are recording today's talk, and I will post the recording on YouTube once the webinar is complete and it's fully downloaded. You will notice that the chat box is disabled, but in the middle of the bottom bar, you can access the Q&A window, which allows us to see your questions and then post them and resolve them and put comments on them. So you can submit your questions or you can upvote some other questions and comments through that box. Now, another new feature is the translated captions. It's a real-time caption translation service that allows you to select your preferred caption language for today's webinar. To use it, just turn on the captions, switch the translation option on, and then select your preferred captions language. And right now, I will launch a short poll to find out who's with us today. And you can take a couple of minutes to fill it out and submit it whenever you would like. Wow, we have almost 100 people today. Um, Seems like the numbers for the poll are pretty stable. Almost everyone seems to be done. So let me go ahead and share results. All right, so we have a pretty even distribution of peoples and roles and also places where you heard about the seminar. Thank you very much for filling it out. Now, with no further ado, let me introduce our first speaker. So, Natalie Nelson is from the Department of Biological and Agricultural Engineering at NC State University. She directs the Coastal and Watershed Analytics Lab, which focuses on studying and modeling non-point source pollution in inland and coastal waters, with a special focus on North Carolina. And today she will be telling us about hers and hers lab's research and the special instruments they're using to produce data and share it with the practitioners and researchers alike. So, Natalie, take it away.
Thanks so much, Maggio, and thanks to all of the Global Change Research Fellows for the invitation to speak with you all today. I just want to confirm, since I'm the first to go, that everything looks okay with the screen.
Looks good, I would say, and we can hear
Okay.
you loud and clear.
All right. Excellent. Thank you. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking to you all about Shellcast, which is a forecast and notification tool that we developed for shellfish farmers and harvesters. But before I get into the tool and the mechanics of how it works and what we've learned thus far, I'll share a little bit about the decision-making activity that motivated the creation of the tool. So coastal waterways where shellfish are grown are going to be divided into what are referred to as different growing areas. And these growing areas will be assigned harvest classifications based on typically their safety for harvest. So there can also be administrative considerations in terms of which areas are going to be considered acceptable for harvest. And here when I refer to shellfish, I'm talking about oysters and clams and scallops. And so here what you see is part of the North Carolina coast. And then these kind of strange looking polygons are the administrative boundaries associated with individual growing areas. And then within these growing areas, we can have different wild reefs or wild beds, but then also mariculture systems that we would consider to be more like farms that are being maintained through different types of these culture-based equipment. And so when we have oysters or clams, for example, they're going to be filter feeding from the water column around them. And in the process of that filter feeding, they can take up pollutants that are in the water. And we're particularly concerned with fecally associated pollutants like different types of pathogens, which we tend to see increase in coastal waters immediately following rain events or wet periods. So many of these shellfish growing areas are going to be temporarily closed to harvest immediately following storms and wet periods to avoid any type of seafood contamination. So here the concern is not as much that the shellfish would be harmed, but instead that the people who consume shellfish that have been harvested in contaminated waters could potentially get sick. So places like North Carolina, and this varies state by state in terms of the practices that are used, but in North Carolina, these different shellfish growing areas are assigned rainfall thresholds, at least the ones that are referred to as conditionally approved. So these are areas that are approved for harvest, but with these special conditions. And so these rainfall thresholds correspond to depths of rainfall within a 24-hour period. And if that threshold is exceeded, that waterway or that shellfish growing area will be temporarily closed for harvest, and it will only be reopened once a sample has been collected and they've enumerated fecal bacteria from the sample and confirmed that conditions have returned to a safe baseline. So here, for example, we're again looking at part of the North Carolina coast with each of these polygons being different shellfish growing areas. And here the red is corresponding to a 1-inch rainfall threshold. So what we see here at the head of the Newport River estuary is that if there's 1 inch of rain in 24 hours, these areas will immediately close for harvest until safe conditions are confirmed. In other places like Florida, they'll use multiple criteria. So not just rainfall within a 24-hour period, but some places will also have criteria that are based on river stage. And then there are other places that also have seasonally variable criteria. So for example, here we're looking at part of the Florida coast where we have Apalachicola Bay. And in the Apalachicola Bay, there's a seasonal change in the status of these different shellfish growing areas. So based on the state and the place, there can be several considerations to account for, but one commonality is that there's typically concern about contamination of shellfish harvest areas immediately following storms and wet periods. And so once these types of temporary closures have been instated, the state regulatory authority will issue a notice to declare that there are harvest closures in place. And so in North Carolina, they do that through the posting of proclamations, which is shown here on the left. There's also a shellfish sanitation temporary closure public viewer, which is a GIS-based system where they'll display closures. And then other states have similar types of platforms, and there's also going to be hotlines that are updated where people can phone in and get the status of different waterways. So these proclamations are communicated through multiple channels, but they're communicated once they're enacted. And so a few years ago, when I had started here at NC State, I had connected with Chuck Wyrick, who at the time was the Marine Aquaculture Extension Agent with North Carolina Sea Grant, and he's now at the National Sea Grant Program. And he had asked if we could create a tool that would give growers a heads up as to when these temporary closures might be coming. So basically the idea being that since they're based on rainfall and wet conditions, that we could use existing forecast products like what the National Weather Service produces and use that to give some type of advance notice that a temporary closure could be occurring in the near future instead of them only being aware of the closures once the proclamation is posted. And so that's what we did. We created a tool called Shellcast, which offers forecasts of temporary harvest closures in estuary and shellfish waters caused by rainfall. And so this tool is free to use. And the way it operates is that we take in information from the National Weather Service. So we use their probabilistic quantitative precipitation forecast. We also use some antecedent rainfall data, and then we combine that information with the management thresholds, like those rainfall thresholds I described before, and we use those two pieces of information to then estimate near-term closure risk. And so the way that we transmit this information is through a web application. You can visit our site by going to go.ncsu.edu/shellcast. And on the main landing page, you'll see that we color each of the shellfish growing areas based on the risk of closure today, tomorrow, and in 2 days. And so users are also able to add specific operations to their profile such that they can see pins that correspond to those different, for example, oyster farms, where they'd be able to then also get more tailored information and notifications like text notifications shown here or email notifications or both. With the forecast information for their sites. We originally created the tool for North Carolina through a grant from a North Carolina Sea Grant, and so that initial effort had been led by Dr. Sheila Saya, who was a postdoctoral researcher at the time. And then we were able to get follow-on funding from SOCORA, the Southeast Coastal Ocean Observing Regional Association, to expand the tool to South Carolina and Florida. And Makiko Shukonobe has been leading the efforts to expand into these new areas and then also to improve our existing algorithms. And I also just want to mention, given the focus of this panel session, that the grant that was received by SOCORA not only supported the expansion of Shellcast, but it also supported the expansion of the beach conditions reporting system and House the Beach. So these are 2 additional decision support tools that I encourage you all to look into if you're interested in water quality decision support systems. And so we also had undergone some beta testing with a group of North Carolina-based shellfish growers in what we referred to as a pilot deployment program. And we basically wanted to understand if shellfish growers found Shellcast to be useful and then what functions and features they found to be most useful. And this work was led by Carrie Clower, who was the communications research facilitator working with our team. And so here I'm going to highlight 2 quick takeaways from that pilot deployment program, and I'll also highlight some challenges that were associated with some of these findings. So the first is that the beta testers found the text and email notifications to be the most useful feature of the tool. So a lot of time was spent on creating that landing page, but ultimately the notifications were what people found most useful. And so this was really important to know because the challenge I'll highlight is that this has been one of the most difficult features to maintain because of changes in regulations and policies that are designed to protect consumers from spam. So I'm all for it. These are welcome changes in regulations and policies, but they have been challenging for us to keep up with to ensure that we can maintain that functionality. But knowing through this pilot deployment program that this was considered one of the most advantageous features of the tool, we've kept up with the effort to try and maintain this feature. We also learned that growers who have operations in waters with low rainfall thresholds were more likely to find Shellcast useful. So basically, if a shellfish farmer had an operation in an area with a really low rainfall threshold, like 1 or 1.5 inches that leads to closure, they were more likely to find the forecast to be useful and informative for their decision making, whereas the people who had operations in really high rainfall threshold areas didn't see as much use and utility for the tool. And this makes sense too because the 4-inch storms are often going to be newsworthy. Like you already hear about that in your local news or local radio, that there's going to be these storms that are coming. And so this, I thought, made a lot of sense that then the people who are more likely to be hit with surprise storms would be the ones who found it most useful. But then this also creates challenges because small storms can be really hard to predict. So these more like single cell convective thunderstorms are really challenging to accurately predict and forecast, whereas frontal storms are easier. And so then that also contributes to how accurate our predictions are. It's completely hinging on the accuracy of the weather forecasts. So some takeaways here to consider for your own tool development. The first is that we found that those who are most likely to benefit from shellcast forecasts were also those who experienced the greatest prediction uncertainty. So people who had operations in low rainfall threshold areas. And my feeling from this was that an imperfect decision support tool is still better than no decision support tool, was kind of my interpretation. I encourage those who are undergoing these types of tool development efforts to think about scaling early and often. So if your forecast model or your tool were to be applied to a new area, how would your system hold up? And we had to confront this when we went from being North Carolina specific to then extending into South Carolina and Florida. And finally, if you don't have access to a full-time developer, I would encourage exploring opportunities to piggyback onto these existing decision support tools, seeing how you can collaborate, because keeping up with various changes that come through, like changes in regulations and policies, can be quite challenging if you don't have a full-time staffer. But if you're able to share that load across tools, I think that you're more likely to have more seamless operations. So I look forward to the discussion after. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Natalie, for your presentation. It was quite exciting, and I see that there's already many people in the chat either raising hand or perhaps presenting some questions. Just a reminder, we are going to discuss at the end of the 3 presentations so that our panelists can address maybe one question altogether and discuss with each other. So don't hesitate to post a question directly in the Q&A or well, write down on a piece of paper and at the end you can ask it verbally. Now, our next speaker is Dr. Ann Meany, the senior scientist for the Lower Mississippi Valley Joint Venture and the American Bird Conservancy. So Ann provides biological and ecological information to benefit conservation of high priority bird species within the Lower Mississippi Valley and West Gulf Coast Plain region. And she's going to tell us about her organization and the work that is going on there. Take it away.
Thank you all so much for having me. I'm very honored to be here with y'all today. So although I'm not specifically coastal, what I'm going to talk about, it just applies to everything that we're doing with decision support tools in conservation. But first, I want to start off telling you a little bit about what a joint venture is, for those of you who don't know. So the Lower Mississippi Valley Joint Venture exists to be a forum for the conservation community to come together for a shared vision of bird conservation. So we're focused on birds, and we cooperate and collaborate together. We work in the Lower Miss across an 8-state region and 2 ecoregions. The dark green is the Mississippi Alluvial Valley. The lighter green is the West Gulf Coastal Plains and Ouachitas. We have a 16 agency and organization management board. We have 2 representatives from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, but they help guide our strategic vision. So we are a self-directed, non-regulatory partnership, and that partnership is key to what we do and how we develop our decision support tools. And we are focused, as I've mentioned, on birds and their habitats. So we work across a whole suite of habitats and taxa. And so there's no limit to the number of decision support tools that we could make. But what it really comes down to is we're trying to implement and communicate the goals and objectives of these national and international bird plans. And where I come into play is thinking about how we take biological science and make meaningful decision support tools that can then help inform habitat delivery, so conservation actions on the ground. And so these are applied decision support tools. I'm just going to give you a brief overview of a couple that we have so you can see the kinds of work that we do. But the main point is all of these decision support tools started with a goal from the partnership and what they wanted. So our first tool is this forest breeding bird decision support model. The goal of this was to increase forest on the landscape to benefit area sensitive landbirds. And our second tool was this wetland complex model for waterfowl. It's a newer model and it's meant to identify and improve complexes on the landscape for wetland species. The reason that our first decision support tool, the forest breeding bird tool, exists is because land birds are not doing well. We're part of this eastern forest biome and birds are declining. And so our partnership rallied around this. Declines have happened since the early 70s. Actually, in 1999 is kind of when we first designed this tool with partners in flight when it came to be. And so this decision support tool has led reforestation efforts in our partnership for decades. Is currently used in wetland reserve easement ranking. It's one of the many criteria that they use. And we use it to inform other habitat delivery priorities. And it really designs a beneficial landscape for land birds and other area sensitive species. And our partnership rallied around this concept of forest core and creating more intact forest patches on the landscape for the benefit of these land birds. And there was a lot of biology that went into designing this. We developed these ecological suites and looked at area requirements of species and densities and all of these other things. And then thought about, okay, if we had this fragmented landscape, because the Mississippi Alluvial Valley is one of the most fragmented forested systems in the country, how can we reestablish this vast landscape that used to be? How do we go from these fragments to reforesting to benefit these land birds? And what we did was pretty simple in design and in inception and concept, but it was very effective. So we looked at where existing forest was on the landscape. We buffered against the effects of like these edge effects, predation, parasitism, what we call hostile habitats, like ag habitats that aren't good for some of these bird species. And then looked at where on the landscape can we build these big blocks of forest, those three different size thresholds that I outlined before. So like I say, very simple, but very effective because it's strategic. And we gathered around that central message of increasing forest core. And when we look at the impact that our model has and where we're maximizing those reforestation benefits to land birds, we see that if we are indeed focusing in those hot red areas, those high priority areas, we're getting a lot more bang for our buck, so to speak. We're putting more forest core on the landscape. And as I mentioned, with this being used in WRE ranking, we're actually seeing that in the Mississippi Alluvial Valley, over half of the acres and wetland reserve easements are really being targeted in our higher priority bands, which is just really cool to see. So this tool is being applied and being used. And the second tool that I'll mention in the next few minutes is our wetland complex model for waterfowl. So we're centrally important for waterfowl continentally. Our joint venture was actually established in 1986 because of the North American Waterfowl Management Plan. And we serve as a centrally important flyway, the Mississippi Flyway, for waterfowl. What our partnership wanted then was a model that would allow us to make decisions based on the needs of waterfowl. And so this is a more recent decision support tool that we developed. It's our wetland complex model for waterfowl. It was only recently approved in the last year or so by our management board. Unlike the forest breeding bird model, we have not yet used this model in any delivery context, although we are having discussions about how we can use it. And so this model is a little bit different. It's creating a diverse landscape, looking at different habitat types, food energy on the landscape, and sanctuary to benefit waterfowl and other wetland dependent species. And so, like anything, we had to sit down and first define what it was that we were going to model and what our goal was. So, with our forest breeding bird model, we centered around the idea of forest core. With this model, we focused around the idea of suitable habitat within the winter home range of mallards. And so we also had to consider what variables we could really reliably measure geospatially. And there's a lot of things we could have put into this model, but kind of the three bins of variables that we thought we could measure pretty well were water on the landscape, wetland types, where sanctuary was, which is where there's no hunting disturbance, and then energy density on the landscape. And so we went through, I'm just going to gloss over the methods, but we went through an exercise to build habitat suitability curves based on the percentage of different habitat types we thought were ideal for a mallard in their winter home range. We actually had an entire geospatial database of where sanctuary was on public land. And so we use that and distance from sanctuary in our model. And then finally, we looked at energy density on the landscape because food during the winter is very important to waterfowl. And then finally, we took this and we weighted each data layer based on its perceived importance to mallards during that season. And as you can see in this model, we opted to weight sanctuary fairly heavily because we thought undisturbed um, that undisturbed rest area that waterfowl needed was really important to their wintering needs, as well as these other different habitat types and food energy. So these two models look very similar in the sense that we have used that bright red that bright red color to kind of prioritize where we would want to take a conservation action of some sort. But they have fundamentally different landscape objectives, and they were very differently constructed. The forest breeding bird here, the model here on the left, was constructed thinking about forest patches and creating a kind of monotypic forested landscape. This wetland complex model for waterfowl was developed thinking about the home range of a mallard and using focal statistics across the entire valley. But both of these tools are powerful to help inform conservation action and conservation decisions. As I mentioned, our forest breeding bird model has already been used to help with wetland reserve easement ranking, and we're in discussions about how our wetland complex model can also be used to help with that. And so we're able to use these tools to help leverage conservation practices that are meaningful. And so you can imagine how these tools that are based on the biology, the specific biology of species and their needs, can really help to catalyze conservation action on the ground. All right. And so with that overview, thank you all for listening to me. So many partners have contributed to our joint venture partnership and making these tools possible and using them. And then there's some of the literature there and more information on our models if you would like to dig into the details.
Hey, thank you very much. Our presentations have extended to different ecosystems, different organisms, and a different part of the country. And so now we will top it off with our final speaker, that is Logan Benedict. Logan is the adaptation and landscape specialist for the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. He leads the FWC's Climate Resiliency and Landscape Scale Conservation teams, who both look at the larger landscape, connectivity of the habitat, and the future of Florida's wildlife habitats, as well as the connections between people and the natural environment. So I'm sure he will have plenty to talk about. Logan, take it away.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. I'm going to talk. I have I think, the fun perspective today of talking about the application of a tool and my role in a state agency. I'm not actually the creator of this tool, but actually the kind of end user of it and how we've applied it in Florida with partners. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Okay. So first off, I was just going to throw up a slide showing that there are actually many different kind of guides and frameworks to get to adaptation planning, which is what I'm talking about today, kind of planning for the future, adapting to climate shifts. But specifically, I'm drilling in today on how we in Florida have applied resist, accept, direct. All of these are great, but I'm going to dig into RAD. So kind of generally, what is RAD? I look at it, and those who I've worked with, Best Eyes at U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service being a major one, and many FWC, TNC, National Park Service staff, is really a facilitation tool to help people be creative about their planning for future, something that's uncertain, hard to visualize. And I think it's a great tool for helping visualize and plan for that. So a major focus of RAD and what you're trying to really look at when applying this is ecological transformation. And that is the change happening on the landscape that rearranges historical species compositions and function of those habitats. And I will say that in a lot of past climate adaptation planning efforts I've been involved with or helped lead, there's a lot of focus on species specific. What is exactly might happen to this species or some of the host plants or something it relies heavily on, and not really looking at how the entire system around it might be changing and what the implications are overall, and what to do about that function, composition changing around. So ecological transformation is a big theme of applying RAD or using it as a tool. And ecological transformation is something that is already happening. I'm sure probably everybody on this call has an example in their head of where they're seeing ecological transformation happen, be it boreal forest, or in this example of coastal salt marsh habitat shifting into mangrove forest. And as you can see, these photos are even a few years old to approximately a decade old. And likely that mangrove forest is now a lot more dense of a mangrove forest. So things are changing on the landscape, the function of those habitats, the species compositions within them. And RAD helps kind of look at what to do in those changing systems. So explaining what each thing means, resist, accept, direct. Resist is working to restore or maintain a process or function that's based upon a historic condition or accepted or acceptable current condition. What you're aiming your restoration goals towards or things like that. What do you view as the historic state you're trying to get that habitat to stay as or continue to be? Accept, on the other hand, is acknowledging that shift and allowing that process to happen. Those changes are, you're mindful of those, but you're not taking direct action to prevent them from moving to the system they are, that change, that transformation. So we think back for resist and accept on just the mangrove example. Resisting would be working to try to keep it in that salt marsh form, and resisting the mangrove through many methods. Removal could be one of them, but accepting would be seeing that is happening and allowing that transformation to take place. Whereas direct is action direct action to move the system to something, a desired future condition for that system. And perhaps that could be mangrove, and you might work to facilitate the increase of mangrove forest in that system, or there might be a different desired future condition that you do on the ground management for to try to shift the system into a desired future condition that you, as an agency or whatever group, prefer or see as more ecologically functional. This is a nice key. There can be blurred lines between what is accept, direct, resist, but this is a nice key that kind of helps you decide, are you accepting, directing, or resisting? Are you intervening, trying to shape the trajectory? If not, you're likely accepting. If you are taking management actions, that are they based on historic conditions? If so, you might be resisting. If not, you might be directing that trajectory. So I also wanted to put up some past work that we had done in Florida, because I'm also going to talk a little bit about comparison. And we've done some scenario planning work, climate adaptation planning work in Florida before RAD, kind of came into the fray, and looking at multiple scenarios, incorporating models, SLAM being one of them listed, and trying to determine actions that we could take for species, in this example, throughout the Florida Keys that don't necessarily have great pathways for migration and are facing these accelerating changes, saltwater inundation, et cetera, on these low-lying islands. So we developed a lot of actions for these species, but, after RAD came out as a framework, those partners involved from TNC, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, FWC, kind of framed it and talked a little bit more about what we had done, and realized that most of what we had kind of come up with or proposed had been resisting change. How do we keep it the way it is? How do we prevent things from changing? So we decided to come back and have a follow-up workshop with a suite of partners in the Florida Keys, and again, involving FWC, TNC, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and National Park Service, but a very diverse array of partners as well weighing in on this. And one thing I'll say is that, it was a very effective tool. I think it got people more creative, and we did end up with a bigger diversity of actions when you kind of give people the guidance and permission to think about what the future looks like if you accept some of those inevitable shifts or changes, or, what might you do if you could direct the trajectory of change. So I think we ended up with a bigger suite of options, but again, that's more what this is about, that creative space of thinking more about a greater future, a diverse future of options, not necessarily making the decisions for you. I'm going to get into some quick examples. A resist one that we discussed during this. So again, these aren't things that we're necessarily taking action on, but potentials. Is we were worried about maintaining viable populations of American crocodiles in South Florida and the Florida Keys, and ensuring their nesting habitat is a large part of that. That's something that's eroding and decreasing due to sea level rise, hurricanes, but also temperatures are increasing. And that can skew sex ratios for many reptiles, but we had discussions around the crocodile here. We might resist that change is the option here, to maintain that viable population of crocodiles and not skew the sex ratio. Actions proposed involved shading nests, providing nesting material that might be cooler material or stay cooler than what is currently available, and actively potentially watering nests to keep those sex ratios a little close to what they had been historically. And again, this strategy coming back to the main objective there of ensuring suitable nesting habitat. Another one that this fits in the accept form of things, we talked about the Florida key deer, and this is one dealing with sea level rise, storm surge, of course, but seeing a lot of salinization of their freshwater resources. Freshwater is something that's very important to all these species in the Keys, but is actually shifting away from being available to more saline. The except here, this one gets a little gray, is allowing the change to occur. We're not combating, deciding not, potentially not combating or deciding to keep those systems freshwater as it seems expensive or difficult. But that doesn't mean we give up on freshwater for the key deer. So there's some alternate actions that still came about of that. Maybe we are accepting the change of the system, but there are other actions we can take to provide fresh water for the key deer moving forward. Directing change, an example of the Lower Keys marsh rabbit here. In maintaining that habitat, sea level rise is impacting that habitat. Mangrove is actually moving into the uplands and kind of pinching or decreasing their habitat by quite a bit. And you're seeing, upland and mangrove. So the direct action here is, rather than it being mangrove or directing away from what it is becoming and transforming to, taking some actions that actually alter the elevation, substrate, and provide a suitable kind of shift towards future of it being upland marsh in these areas. So we're looking for a desired future condition there and pushing towards that condition. This one, you don't need to get too much detail. Please don't bother yourself reading all of that or making your head spin. But I like to show this too, because it shows that I think a lot of people think when you're doing RAD, you're deciding to resist, or you're deciding to accept, or you're deciding to direct. And it's kind of no middle ground. But really, you can decide to take different actions, either RA or D, at different times. And that might be at different intervals of sea level rise, different temperature thresholds. You might shift your strategy as a different threshold is reached, from resist to accept. But I also like the site A-B kind of example there, because this can be applied spatially as well. You're not looking at the entire Florida Keys and saying, this is the resist strategy we've chosen for all of the Florida Keys. It might be diverse even within a management area where you're applying R, A, or D. And a quick kind of hypothetical example I like to give of that is, this is the kind of Big Bend Nature Coast area of Florida. So you're thinking looking at Gulf side here, and there's a transformation. We're already kind of aware that salt marsh might be migrating inland or could be migrating inland, but things are shifting with sea level rise and salinity changes. We're also seeing the loss of certain coastal island systems, which we call ghost forests, that once were freshwater dependent tree species now are all dying, leaving dead standing wood, and that habitat is shifting. As mentioned in the beginning, this is traditionally salt marsh. Mangrove is rapidly moving into these areas and changing the system. And then, of course, we have invasive species marching their way into all of these areas as well. So I feel like, these are the types of large-scale changes across the landscape where you would apply RAD and think about how you might even apply resisting, accepting, or directing spatially throughout this entire area. You wouldn't necessarily make a decision for all of this coast, be it R, A, or D. It's very situational. So just a hypothetical example there, but some of the closing thoughts, RAD does give us permission to explore, get creative, and have fun when thinking about things. But based on my past experiences and applying RAD as well, I feel like it does open people up to a diversity of options that we weren't necessarily considering before. And it helps us develop a wider range of adaptation actions. And the partner part is, I think, a very big part of it. If you can incorporate as many partners as you can into utilizing this tool and being creative with it. And again, reinforcing it's not a decision framework, but it's setting you up, I think, to be more informed in your decision making. And that is it for me. Sorry if I went a little over.
By all means, it's a very complex topic to talk about, and examples are necessary. So right now I would invite Logan, Anne, and Natalie to turn on their camera again and perhaps consider discussing some of the questions that have been left in the Q&A. First and foremost, thank you very much for your time presenting and for the willingness to be together and discuss some topics that could be common to the three of you in your work. I will start with the first question I can read in the Q&A, to which Dr. Almini already started answering, but maybe we can discuss it synchronously as well. And it comes from Jennifer Cudney, who asks, are there declines in land bird numbers driven by declines in one or a few particularly abundant species, or is it across the board? And I will let Dr. Mini answer.
Thank you. No, that's a fabulous question. The declines, it's based on suites of species. It's no one, particular species. As many species are not doing well. The ones that are doing well are the ones that have been able to adapt very well to human environments and urban environments, and some of those things. But yeah, across the board, the declines are largely driven by two groups, disturbance dependent species. So those species that need like fire on the landscape or forest management. And then secondly, actually a lot of coastal species. And so providing that coastal forest habitat, it provides a buffer actually, right? When you start thinking about climate resilience. But my counterpart, there's an Atlantic Coast joint venture, and they spend a lot of time thinking about like salt marsh sparrow and some of those other species that are driving some of these declines. I'm going to put a link to the State of the Birds report in the Q&A for you so you can learn more.
Fantastic. And Natalie and Logan, feel free to ever intervene on any question that feels relevant to your work, at least in some respect. Before going on to the next question, let me remind all the members in the audience that if you feel more inclined to present your questions verbally, you can just raise your hand and we will unmute you and you will be able to ask right away. But as you think about it, I will read another question we have in the chat. This one is mostly directed to Logan and it takes some reading, so let me go ahead. So one of our attendees says that they have a RAD framework question, specifically, how do managers prioritize adaptation decisions if and when there are competing regulatory frameworks? For example, in the Everglades, the dry moor prairies support the federally endangered Cape Sable seaside sparrow, but these ecosystems are changing as a result of increasing freshwater diversions through the Everglades hydrologic restoration planning interventions and increases in saltwater intrusion and ecosystem transition in more coastal areas. So here there's some competing policy preservation scheme. So I feel like this question goes towards Logan directly, but saltwater intrusions and different competing priorities sound like something that Anne and Natalie talked about too. So go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I'll try to answer, but I certainly can't speak specifically to that Sable seaside sparrow. And I do believe people are working to apply the RAD framework to the Cape Sable seaside sparrow. I'm just not directly a part of that effort. But that's a tough one. I can say that, that's one of our considerations, especially spatially, looking at how RAD gets applied. And there might be areas where it is critical to advocate for resisting change to give species more time to adapt, or that are very critical sites for species. So I think that would be discussions with people that you're applying this framework with, and discussions with leadership as well about how best to apply the actions you come up with and prioritize from there. But there are certainly situations where, say, black rail might be something that you really don't want mangrove encroachment necessarily changing their habitat that they're used to. And there you might apply resist or advocate for applying resist as opposed to accepting or directing the shifts you see there. It's the best I can answer for right now.
Okay, absolutely. And if there are follow-up questions, again, don't hesitate to raise your hand or post a follow-up directly in the Q&A. There's actually another question coming up about the RAD framework, and it comes from Sherry Keller, who asks whether there are any plans to add the model for helping to prioritize areas for RAD. She remarks, spatial would be great, but even if it is just some thoughts on decision making. So this goes again towards Logan.
Hey, Cherie. Not that I'm aware of as far as any specific tool or model to where to apply RAD, but I think that would be very interesting. I know we certainly think about it when applying the tool to areas, but as far as prioritizing and determining where to apply RAD, I can't say.
Well, I suppose that perhaps I will ask a question for the three of you, and whoever wants to take it can go ahead. But all the decision-making instruments you have presented, in some respect, have to do with climate change. And of course, we come from CCASC, so climate adaptation science is somewhat one of the focuses of the seminar. Your decision-making tools address some specific aspects of climate change adaptation policy. But what would you say is the general state of climate change adaptation in your area? What are some gaps, for example, that you feel like will be instrumental, if not maybe fundamental, to achieving your goals and making your tools work at the best of their potential? Thank you so much.
Sure, I can take a stab at that. Yeah, so our models, what we're trying to do is really build some of that resiliency in the system through habitat restoration and management. And one key issue in our geography, something that we're trying to wrap our heads around is how water availability is going to change. And there's been some drastic changes in hydrology throughout the Mississippi Alluvial Valley and some of the tributaries, and that affects forest health, it affects wetland function. And so we're building these tools, somewhat assuming that we're going to be okay into the future with some of these things, but we need more science to help us kind of fully get a better understanding of, some of the climate change of water availability, how that's going to impact our landscape. And so I'm a bird biologist. I'm not a hydrologist, but that's the beauty of having a partnership and other people who can help us think through these things.
Yeah, I mean, I guess on my side, we're not dealing as much with like direct climate adaptation planning. I'd say instead, like we're dealing with really near-term decision making. And so uh, we rely really heavily, though, on different types of weather forecast products. And like what I was describing with regards to the smaller storms being difficult to predict. I mean, there are definite connections with climate and different storm types and their predictability. So I know that there are cases where there are researchers who have already developed improvements to the types of forecast products that we're using that better account for some of these uncertainties in weather forecasting. But just in terms of helping to realize the potential of those products to help improve our tool, I think greater public access to these types of more like cutting edge forecast systems. And I recognize that's easy to say and hard to do because there's a lot that has to go into making a product fully operational. But for us, I think that's probably the place where we'd stand to benefit the most.
I'll just quickly say to a little step aside from maybe resources or things needed, but I think some of it is time and social change for people. Whenever I first started doing this type of work, I think conversations around adaptation were very difficult, and people felt like it was some far flung concept. And that's been changing quite a bit, where I think people are more ready for those conversations, but they have kind of especially a lot of managers I talk to have a gap of understanding of what could be done or what to do. They're eager to do something, but now aren't sure what to do in the face of uncertainty and change. So I think that's a gap that we have to continue to try to help meet without necessarily having the answers to say this is exactly what you should do, but help people get to the point where they can make better informed decisions on how to move forward.
Yeah, it's somewhat strange to be asking about a problem that is being addressed while the problem changes in the meantime. Um, but well, let me take the opportunity to ask a question specifically for Natalie then. So this one comes from Megan Blancher, and she asks, your end users are industry folks, different than those whose end users are management entities. How did you get the word out about Shellcast in North Carolina?
Yeah, we partnered with a few different groups. So, especially through Sea Grant, Eric Herbst, who's the Marine Aquaculture Extension Agent, has been really helpful with connecting us with growers directly, but also inviting us to present at conferences like the North Carolina Aquaculture Development Conference, which is well attended by industry. So, we've mostly leaned on our partners who directly interface with growers.
Thank you very much. Um, I'm afraid I'm sorry. Now there's many questions arriving, but we are very close to the end of the seminar. So let me take another one. Perhaps this one is a bit more general, and it comes from an anonymous attendee who asks, with AI and machine learning models and applications like ChatGPT, um, how can you uh, how can you take advantage of these instruments in your gamut of work if it's something that you have considered?
Well, I don't have much to say in terms of how a tool like ChatGPT could help, but at least with regards to machine learning, just as a very quick comment, with what I was describing previously in terms of improved forecasting, there's a lot that's being done by different types of meteorological researchers who are using deep learning methods and like so a lot of the products that I was describing vaguely before are rooted in machine learning algorithms to help advance forecasting. So that's an area where definitely I think that there are a lot of improvements on the horizon, if not already here, just maybe not quite operational yet.
Yes, and I'll agree with that. I mean, we often, in designing these tools, we're using pretty complex methods, some of which comes from, right, probably AI based things to create these models. And so I think, yeah, it's an exciting tool for potential use, seeing as how these AI tools and other things can help us into the future with developing models. I know friends who use it to check their code and make sure that they've constructed the model correctly. So yeah, lots of uses for it as we go into the future.
I don't have much of an answer on it myself. A lot of what I do is, sitting down in a room full of partners and stakeholders and going through these frameworks and discussions to try to be creative with each other. So there might be ways that these things could apply, but at least on the fly right now, I don't know. So
Absolutely. Thank you very much for giving a step to the question. Um, well, it looks like all the questions are addressed, and we are practically at time. So the first thing I would like to do would be just thanking our speakers for taking the time to present today and consider some of our questions. Unfortunately, there's no crowd that can be seen clapping, but let's give a virtual round of applause to the three of them. And for some housekeeping, let me advertise the fact that on December the 2nd at 2 p.m., there's going to be an informational webinar about the program that I am part of and that organized this seminar. So the Global Change Research Fellows, which will have an application round coming up. So we will talk about what that application is all about and hopefully gauge your interest in the matter. And secondly, we are going to uh, organize an event on the December 18th at 1 p.m., which is all about collaboratively assessing the status and vulnerability of bees in the southeastern and US Caribbean, which is where CCASC operates. And well, don't forget that if you're interested in coming back to this webinar or sharing it with colleagues and friends, it's going to be on YouTube soon. And you can find more materials like this on CCASC's newsletter. And with that, thank you very much, everybody, for attending. Thank you, panelists, for presenting. And see you very soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Maggio. Bye.